So we'll continue from where we left off last week. Remember, we are discussing the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. And the objective of this program basically is to educate everyone regarding the potential available within the African continent, such that at the end of the day, the whole idea around the African Continental Free Trade Agreement will not be a waste. AFCFTA presents for us a very, very unique opportunity to be able to leverage on the opportunity within the continent, the 1.2 billion people, to be able to grow our businesses. And like I've said severally, that you don't need to be an exporter, a manufacturer of the product that you want to export. What should be very important to you is not you being the manufacturer yourself, but the fact that you are able to take advantage of this opportunity by leverage on other people who are producing, in which case you become a merchant, buying and selling. And you can decide at the end of the day to go into the actual production of the item yourself. For 2019, intra-African exports were valued at 69 billion. That's exports within Africa. 15% of that 15% of Africans' world exports. So when you look at what has happened, someone said they cannot hear the sound. Eze Dominic. Other people has already said they can hear me. So if you can't hear me, I guess it's your mic that is having an issue. Eze Dominic. If you can't hear me, I guess your mic that is having an issue. So I was talking about the fact that African export is just 15%. Intra-African export is just 15% of the world export that African do. That means if Africa is doing almost 70 billion in export, 70 billion in export, if Africa is doing almost 70 billion in export, that means 15% of that, that's about 10 billion or 10.5 billion. 15% of that is what Africa is, intra-African trade is 69 billion, and that's 15% of our world export. That means we are doing like ×5 or ×6 actually of this. But how much are we doing among ourselves? Very small. African export is over 400 billion, but about 69 billion is done within Africa among Africans. So that means that we are really not doing a lot among ourselves, but that's the idea behind AFCFTA. Between 2008 and 2019, African exports and African world export respectively declined by 5% and 8%. Although South Africa is the main inter-African exporter, South Africa is the main inter-African exporter and importer, accounting for 35% of inter-African export and 70% of import. South Africa intra-African trade declined, while intra-African export from Nigeria and Zimbabwe and intra-import by Ghana and Mozambique increased significantly. Up until now, the major exporter in Africa is South Africa. The major importer in Africa is South Africa. So South Africa is a market that anyone planning or thinking of AFCFTA, South Africa is a market to go. South Africa is a market to go. If anyone is thinking of AFCFTA, one of the markets you cannot ignore is the South African market. One of the markets you cannot ignore is the South African market. What does South African import? We're going to look at that, John Adeniji, we're going to look at that. We're going to look at that. We're going to look at different, in the course of this training, we're going to look at different countries and what they import. So you can have a sense of, okay, that means this country buy this country buy this, we're going to do different country and what they import. Like I said, this will continue till December. different countries and what they import. We're going to be looking at that. Other main intra-African exporters are Nigeria, Egypt, Cote d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast, Zimbabwe, and they account for 31% of intra-African exports. 23% of intra-African exports are mineral fuel, followed by export of machinery. Now, 23% of intra-African export is minerals, followed by machinery, floating structures, vehicles, and precious metals. Apart from South Africa, all other main intra-African imports, except Ghana, are also in Southern Africa. Apart from South Africa, all other main intra-African imports, except Ghana, are also in Southern Africa. So Botswana, Mozambique, Namibia, Zambia also contribute to a lot of import in Africa. These are markets to look at. Between 2018 and 2019, Ghana's intra-African import more than double. Mozambique import increased by 22%. The biggest portion of African world export of cereal, photography equipment, arms, ammunition, printed books, and articles of base metal are intra-African exports. So look at this chart, for example. This is South Africa. South Africa, 70% of intra-African import and 12% of South African import are intra-Africa. South Africa is contributing 17% of intra-African import and 12% of South African import are intra-Africa. So South Africa, 12% of the total import of South Africa is from Africa. Now, this is just telling you that, look, South Africa is the market to be. The market to be. The market to be. How about Ghana? 7%. Sorry, I think there's something wrong with that chart. Yeah, something wrong with the chart. Okay. It was not showing very well. I think it's better now. Botswana. Look at Botswana. 7% of intra-African import is done by Botswana. 7%. 69% of Botswana import are intra-Africa. Botswana is doing a lot of import from Africa, and they actually import a lot from South Africa. A lot. Can you see? Botswana is doing a lot of import from South Africa and Namibia. South Africa and Namibia. Then Ghana. Ghana. Look at Ghana. 7% of intra-African import of Ghana, of African import is from Ghana. And 11% of Ghana's import are intra-Africa. 11% are intra-Africa. And you can see South Africa, Nigeria, Ivory Coast, Egypt, and Morocco are the source of import of Ghana. What are the source of import of South Africa? Can you see South Africa? Nigeria, Eswatini, Mozambique, Namibia, and Ghana are the major source of import of South Africa. Look at this chart. It looks a little bit very complex, but we break it down. Main destination of African market. The main destination market are located in Southern Africa. Southern Africa. the main destination market, are located in Southern Africa. The main exports are petrol. This is looking at intra-African export. Petrol. Majority of intra-African export is from Southern Africa. Majority of intra-African export is from Southern Africa. So if I'm thinking of exporting in Africa, one country I must look out for is Southern Africa. Southern Africa. And by Southern Africa, you know that it's not just South Africa alone, but a number of other countries in Southern Africa. Why is this important? So that when you are looking at market to consider, you focus on that important market. And from the conversation we're having right now, you now know where those important markets are located. Southern Africa. Botswana being one of them. Namibia being one of them. Mozambique being one of them. Zambia being one of them. And the main exports are petrol, vehicles, energy, electrical energy. So if you look at this chart, you will see 23% of world export. 23% of world export is being done by, look at Cote d'Ivoire. 23% of Cote d'Ivoire world export is done in Africa. 23% of Cote d'Ivoire world export is done in Africa. And what are the exports? Palm oil, extract, beauty product, tobacco, footwear, mainly in the intra-African zone. If you look at Zimbabwe, even though Zimbabwe is contributing 4% of export in Africa, but 80% of South African and 30% to Mozambique. Majority of Zimbabwe export is going to South Africa and Mozambique. South Africa and Mozambique. Nigeria is contributing 16% of African export. And 20%, and this contributes 20% of the total export of Nigeria. 20% of the total export of Nigeria go to Africa. But that 20% constitutes 16% of the total export within Africa. 76% is going of our export is going to Ghana, South Africa, Ivory Coast. 52% is crude. 14%, and that's 40% of the world. 52% of our export to Africa is crude. 25% floating structures and 19% metals, tubings, metal flex and tubing. Egypt, 67% of Egypt is going to neighboring North African countries. Neighboring North African countries. Neighboring North African countries. Neighboring North African countries. That's where it's going. And who are those buying? Tunisia, Libya, Morocco, and Algeria. Tunisia, Libya, Morocco, and Algeria. And that's where Egypt is contributing 7% of African export. You will notice South Africa, this is as of last year, South Africa is contributing 35% last year. Almost more than times 2 of Nigeria. 35% of South African export goes to 35% of African export is done by South Africa. And 27% of South African exports altogether goes to Africa. So who are the top 10 exporters in Africa? South Africa, 35%. Nigeria, 16%. Egypt, 7%. Ivory Coast, 4%. Zimbabwe, 4%. Namibia, 3%. Morocco, 3%. Kenya, 3%. Eswatini, 3%. And Senegal, 3%. These are the top exporters in Africa. Top exporters in Africa. So, in a way, we have started trading among ourselves. The challenge is because we don't have a free trade agreement, we are unable to do it very well. So what this AfCFTA is going to do for us at the end of the day is to make us to trade more among ourselves. Can you imagine that a whole Nigeria will be doing 16%? 16%. Why? We have never really taken trade within Africa very seriously. And I think it's time we begin to take it more seriously right now. That's becoming more and more imperative for us to do a lot of trade among ourselves. In 2019, intra-African agricultural trade was valued at $24 billion. 24. Remember, the total was 69. But 24 out of that 69 is agric. So for those doing agric, well done. Opportunity for you in Africa. 11.6 billion export and 10.7 billion import, representing some 17% of total intra-African export and 16% of intra-African import. Only 23% of African total agricultural export are intra-African export, while only 15% of African total agricultural import are sourced from within the continent. 23% of African total agric export are intra-Africa. 23%. We do a lot of agric export outside Africa. South Africa is the main exporter of agric. Can you see? Can you see? To the rest of the continent, followed by Zimbabwe, followed by Egypt. Nigeria is nowhere to be found. Followed by Kenya, followed by Ivory Coast. Ivory Coast mainly export cocoa beans to the continent. Ivory Coast account for most of the agricultural exports to beyond the continent. Followed by South Africa, who export wine and citrus. Followed by Egypt, which exports citrus and onion. A minute, please. All right, sorry for the break in transmission, ladies and gentlemen. Let's continue now. Yes, South Africa, Kenya, Botswana, Namibia, and Egypt are the main intra-African agricultural importers. Are you listening to that? Are you an agric exporter? Look at the market you should be targeting. South Africa, Kenya, Botswana, Namibia, Egypt are the main intra-African agric importer. A quarter of the agricultural import African sourced from outside the continent are more import by Egypt. A quarter of our import from outside the continent. Now look at this, look at this. Look at this. The main intra-African importer of agric are South Africa, Kenya, Botswana, Namibia, and Egypt. But the main importer in Africa, outside Africa, that import from outside Africa is done by Egypt. And what do they import? Wheat, maize, soya beans, and frozen beef. Frozen beef. Frozen beef. So let's look at the main intra-African agricultural export. Main intra-African agricultural export. Main intra-African agricultural export. Sugar. Sugar. 9%. Intra-African agricultural export. 9%. Intra-Africa export as a percentage of world export of that product, 53%. 53%. When you look at the total sugar we ship out, Africa exports altogether, the one exported within Africa is 53%. That means majority of the sugar we are producing is exported to other African countries. Then we have raw tobacco. Intra-African constitute 9% of intra-African export. And that's about 50% of tobacco that is exported. Palm oil, 4% of intra-African export. But that's 91% of exported palm oil. 91%. That means majority of the palm oil produced in Africa are sold in Africa. But it's just about 4% of our total intra-African export. Cigar and cigarette, 3% and 77% of the total export of cigarette. Then maize or corn, 3%. You will notice that, and that's 88% of the total export. So that means majority of our palm oil, cigarette, sugar, tobacco, and maize are sold in Africa. Unfortunately, they constitute very, very small quantity of the trade within Africa. So let's look at South Africa and Zimbabwe. South Africa and Zimbabwe. Main product and destination market under agric. Maize. Food, processed food, apple, and sugar. Maize. 86% of South Africans' world export, world maize export, goes to Botswana, Namibia, and Mozambique. And I think Nigeria also imports maize from South Africa, actually. How about the export of food, processed food? 85% of South African world food preparation export, all that they export to the world, 85% of that is exported to Africa. And who are those that buy it? Mozambique, Namibia, Zambia, and Botswana. You'll notice that a lot of South African exports go to Southern Africa. Just the fact that the way a lot of Nigerian exports go to West Africa. Apple. 39% of the total export of apple from South Africa goes to, hey, Nigeria emerged. Nigeria is a heavy consumer of apple from South Africa. Heavy consumer of apple from South Africa. Nigeria, Senegal, and Kenya. 72% of South African total sugar go to Africa. Who are those that buy? Mozambique, Namibia, and Botswana. Let's go to Zimbabwe. Whereas South Africa is contributing 33% of export, Zimbabwe is contributing 8% of export. Zimbabwe export tobacco, mainly to tobacco tea and macadamia nut, South Africa. Tobacco, sugar, macadamia nut, Mozambique. Raw sugar cane to Kenya. Mainly sugar and cigarette to Botswana. Let's look at Egypt, Kenya, and Ivory Coast. These are the top exporters of agric. Nigeria is now among the top exporters of agric. They are the top exporters of agric. Egypt, Kenya, and Ivory Coast. Egypt contributes 8% of export in Africa. Kenya 7%. Ivory Coast 6%. 12% of Egyptian exports of wheat. 12% of Egyptian export of wheat goes to Africa, Eritrea, Somalia, and Libya. 5% of uncooked pasta. 5% of uncooked pasta. Main destination, Kenya, Eritrea, and Zimbabwe. 5% of uncooked pasta. For Egypt, sugar, 4%. 4%. 4% is going to Kenya. That's 4% of Egypt's sugar export. Kenya, Uganda, and Libya. Then processed cheese, 4%, go to Libya, Eritrea, and Mauritius. Then 4% waste from sugar goes to Morocco and Tunisia. So if you are looking at exporting wheat, pasta, sugar, cheese, and waste from sugar, you know the country. How about Kenya? Tea. 20% of Kenya total tea export and 3% of global tea export are intra-African export. Intra-African export. 11% of the total export of palm oil by Kenya. 11%. So Kenya is contributing 11% of our export of palm, and 99% of that is intra-Africa. Same for cigarette. Intra-African export account for 96% of Kenya cigarette export. 96%. Even though that's 11% of its own export, that's the, looking at the main export rather, main export of Kenya. Tea, palm oil, cigarette, and confectionery. These are the main export of Kenya. Main export of Kenya. And tea is 30% of the export of Kenya. 11% of export of Kenya is palm. 11% of export of Kenya is cigarette. 6% is confectionery. And a good chunk of them are going to Africa. Imagine 99% of confectionery is going to Africa. Under 96% of the sugar of the cigarette is going to Africa. And 99% of palm oil is going to Africa. Ivory Coast, main export destination of Ivory Coast, Burkina Faso, Mali, Ghana, Algeria, and Senegal, constitutes 78% and 64% palm oil. So 78% of Ivory Coast export goes to Burkina Faso, Mali, Ghana, Algeria, and Senegal. And 64% of a combine of palm oil, coffee, extra, tobacco, and soup and broth were the items they are exporting within the African continent. Now, these 5 countries, Kenya, Ivory Coast, Egypt, South Africa, and Zimbabwe, are the major agro exporter in Africa. Looking at commodities, generally commodities. Commodities include both agric and non-agric products. Intra-African commodity exports for 2019 account for 29% of intra-African exports. However, 62% of export of petroleum products, so for petroleum oil rather, 62%. Petroleum oil, petrol, 62%. The rest are gold, gas, oil, concentrate, and limited agri commodities. Only 1% of cocoa, 6% of iron, 5% of petrol, gas remain on the continent. Wow. On the contrary, almost all wheat, oat, live cattle, and soya beans remain on the continent. Look at this. 1% of cocoa production, 6% of iron, and 5% of petrol gas produced are sold in Africa. But almost all our wheat, oat, live cattle, and soya beans oil are sold on the continent. So you can see the demand for wheat, the demand for oat, the demand for cattle, live cattle, and the demand for soya beans. Gold is mainly exported by Zimbabwe and Ivory Coast, almost all of which destined for South Africa. Almost all of the crude oil are by Nigeria. Most of the crude oil export from Africa is by Nigeria, while half of the non-crude export is from South Africa and Egypt. Algeria and Mozambique account for 82% of intra-African petrol gas. 86% of these gas exports are destined for Morocco, South Africa, and Egypt. So energy and natural gas 19% of intra-African export. Precious metal and gold, 12% of intra-African export. Industrial metal, copper, nickel, iron ore, 3% of intra-African export. And agri, including sugar, maize, palm oil, and cocoa, 5% of intra-African export. So let's look at this commodity in detail. Let's look at this commodity in detail. This work is done courtesy TRILAC. I don't know if any of you know TRILAC. TRILAC Trade Law. They are the one that work on this. A very, very, when I saw it, it was so, for me, it was amazing because I like the way they're able to put this data together to be able to help every African make sense of trade within Africa. To help every African make sense of trade within Africa. So kudos to TRILAC. That's trade law. It's trade law organization in South Africa. Now, petrol gas is the main export of Algeria and Mozambique, and 41% of which are export to Egypt, 26% to South Africa, and 90% to Egypt. Let's look at coffee. Coffee. Ivory Coast, Uganda, and South Africa contribute 46%, 16%, and 11% of coffee in Africa, and they are purchased by Algeria, Morocco, South Africa, Namibia, Egypt, and Uganda. That's for coffee. How about maize? How about maize? Intra-African maize exports are mainly South Africa, 68%. Other exporters include Tanzania, 15%, Zambia, 11%, and Kenya, 2%. Maize. Recently we banned maize import because Nigeria do a lot of import of maize. You'll be amazed at the level of maize import being done by Nigeria. The level of maize import being done by Nigeria is alarming. But what's so interesting about this is that Nigeria is supposed to be a net exporter of maize. How come? How come? Nigeria is supposed to be a net exporter of maize. How come? We are not able to export it. It is mainly because we are not competitive in our pricing. 15% of intra-African maize export are to Kenya. So if you want to export maize, Kenya. Who are those doing it? South Africa, Tanzania, Zambia, Kenya. Who are those buying it? Kenya also buy Botswana, Namibia, and Mozambique. How about palm oil? 82% of intra-African exports are by Ivory Coast, Kenya, and Ghana. And the buyer, Senegal, Gambia, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso are major importers of palm oil in Africa. Intra-African exporter of cotton, Sudan, Zimbabwe, Benin Republic, and Zambia are major exporters of cotton. Who are those buying it? Mauritius, South Africa, Egypt. Mauritius, South Africa, Egypt. How about copper? Intra-African copper ore are by two countries, South Africa and Democratic Republic of Congo. Of course, Congo is a major deposit of mineral in the world. 3 countries account for all the intra-African import of copper: Mozambique, Zambia, and Namibia. Mozambique, Zambia, and Namibia. Then iron ore. 99% of iron ore is produced by South Africa and purchased by Mozambique and Egypt. Purchased by Mozambique and Egypt. How about Mauritius? How about cow? Major exporter of cow or cattle is Sudan and Namibia. Major exporter of cattle is Sudan and Namibia. Who are those buying cattle in Africa? Live cattle. South Africa is a major importer of live cattle. Egypt is a major importer of live cattle. Mauritius is a major importer of live cattle. Some people don't know that you can export live cattle. Live cattle. Gold. Gold. Almost all exports are from Zimbabwe, Ivory Coast, and Namibia. Almost all exports. 99% of the import are from South Africa, and the rest is from Ghana and Mali. 99% of import of gold from Zimbabwe, Ivory Coast, and Namibia are by South Africa. South Africa. South Africa. Interesting stuff. Which of these products are you looking at exporting? Now you know those that will be buying from you. Now you know those that will be buying from you. Now you know those that will be buying from you. Main intra-African export products. What are they? Main intra-African export products. What are they? 23% of African world non-commodity agriculture and export are intra-African. 23%. 100%. All export of flexible metal tubing, railway wagon, cyanide, titanium are intra-Africa. 80 to 99% of quicklime, prepare explosive, electrical energy are done in Africa. 60 to 79% of plastic, ginseng, paper, data processing, steel structure, beauty product are export within Africa. 40 to 59% of the manufactured plastic, tubings, iron crews, footwears are done in Africa to other African countries. Then, electrical, 20 to 39% of electrical transformer, furniture, light vessels, aircraft are done within Africa. Then, less than 20% of produced sun, wood, diamond, circuit, t-shirt, coal, and insulated wire are done within Africa. Before I close today, let's look at the last one. Looking at 81% of intra-African export are by Nigeria. Intra-African export of large and small vessels for commodities. 47% of export are destined for Ghana, Angola, and Cameroon. Most of our export of commodities go to Ghana, Angola, and Cameroon. 87% of intra-African export are done by Namibia, Zambia, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and Botswana for this same product. That's for goods, vehicles. 87% of intra-African export. Then for food and beverages and additives. Food and beverage and additives. Egypt and Eswatini are the major export of those products. 39% of which are exported to South Africa, 8% to Nigeria, and 7% to Kenya. Fertilizer. Export of fertilizer, 74%. 74% is done by Morocco. And they are exported to Djibouti, Benin, Ethiopia, Senegal, and Ivory Coast. If you look at flexible tubing, which constitutes 5% of African exports, 99% of that is shipped from Nigeria to Ghana. If you look at electrical energy, which constitutes 40% of African exports, South Africa and Mozambique are the main electrical supplier on the continent. South Africa exports increased by a quarter due to significant increase in export to Botswana, Mozambique. To Botswana. Mozambique also saw an increase in demand from Botswana, Lesotho, Zambia, and Malawi. If you look at diamond, which constitute 3% of intra-African export, intra-African diamond trade is among Botswana, and Namibia, and South Africa. Then 5% of vehicles constitute 3% of African trade, and this 87% of that is done by Namibia, Zambia, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and Botswana. Food and beverage constitute 2% of intra-African trade, and majority is done by, I've talked about that already, Egypt and Eswatini. How about cement? Main exporter of cement, South Africa, Senegal, Zambia. And the main importer, you know this South Africa, Senegal, and Zambia, Dangote is having, what's the name? Plant in all those locations. And who are the main importer? Mali, Libya, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Burkina Faso. Now, this chart is actually to help us make sense. We're going to be going into detail later on. I will be taking each of the products, as many as I can, and I'll be taking not just each of the products, also each of the countries. So, for example, we're going to take a product like corn. Who are the major exporter of corn in Africa? Who are the major importer of corn in Africa? And what volume did they do? We're going to be looking at that. And we're going to be looking at all the 54 countries in Africa, one after the other, discussing the market, the potential of those markets. So it's going, as I said, it's going to be a long journey. And I must thank all of you that have been able to join again today. This information is always available for you on our, I've dropped it again. If you are joining us for the very first time, I've dropped the link for you, the link through which you can join what we are doing. The audio and video recording of this program is always available for you on YouTube. And the link to YouTube is dropped on the Telegram channel.